enough to say, well, it's about tax hikes. What does it mean, tax hikes in general? And it's strange because even anti-austerity pamphlets and researchers just talk about tax hikes. And it's just like, what are you telling me? Nothing, right? It's the typical ideology in the Marxian sense of hiding rather than explaining, right? And I think this is the problem, that somehow the left, the supposed left, has actually internalized a lot of the categories that the austerity experts have wielded against us, and we are kind of taking them on, even by the type of concepts we use in economics, that are ultimately not useful for the fight, if we want to fight. So this is one of the successes of austerity, actually. Austerity is about building consensus for our system. And the way we think also on the left has a lot to do with the success of austerity in the last 100 years. So rather than taking in the idea that we should look at interest rate hikes in general, this book tells you, let's talk about who is getting taxed, of course. So again, austerity is about regressive taxation, meaning that you increase the pool of the taxable population, and then you increase consumption, indirect taxes, like consumption taxes, right? That hit the people. And in the meantime, you cut all taxes on wealth, corporate tax, capital gain taxes, all inheritance taxes. And I think here, again, in the recent budgets have been exactly about this, right? You increase the VAT, and at the same time, you're basically allergic to taxing wealth. So this is fiscal austerity, but fiscal austerity goes with monetary austerity, dear money, right? Increases in interest rates, and industrial austerity. And for me, industrial austerity is the most important element, because it's actually the case that both fiscal and monetary austerity serve the purpose of boosting industrial austerity. The three are related. And in my book, I have a table which is at page, more of like a conceptual table. It's at page 128, 129, in which I really show it's just how they're circular, these three policies, how they enhance one another. And industrial austerity is, well, privatization, labor deregulation, wage repression, attacks on organized labor, and all that we know. So this austerity trinity, which is again about enforcing on the general population the austerity motto, consume less, produce more, right? The majority of us has to consume less, produce more under capitalism, and this is the limit, the economic political limit of our system, is not the product of neoliberalism. And this is another thing that I would really urge comrades on the left to think about, is that it's reductive to attribute the problems of our times to neoliberalism. Because ultimately you buy into the idea that there's something outside of neoliberalism that is still capitalism that is okay and works to fulfill human needs. Now, historically, this has proven not at all the case. And so what what the book shows is that actually austerity emerges very clearly as a militant counteroffensive in the early 1920s. So this is what I would like to say. In how much time do I still have? Okay, perfect. Okay, so sorry, I went a little bit long on the kind of framework and what I think could be interesting elements for the present. But let me try to make it more concrete, what I just said, by looking at the historical case that the book delves into. The claim here is that until the First World War, austerity was naturalized in the sense that we were living in Britain, the empire par excellence. We were living under a laissez-faire capitalism in which, with the gold standard, ultimately the money the hands of social redistribution were completely tied, right? Because ultimately, as soon as the state decided to spend a little bit more, the gold would fly out of the country. So ultimately, the idea was that there was no welfare state at all, right? The welfare state only emerges really with the First World War in Britain itself. And again, I'm taking you guys back to the cradle of capitalism. I'm looking at Western Europe. And again, I think we can discuss how and in what sense we can use this framework also for a country like South Africa and for the whole kind of colonial, neo-colonial domain. But I do think there are some elements that are quite crucial. So austerity was kind of the norm and not really challenged and so not really seen until the First World War. The book begins with the events of the Great War. Now, the Great War were a major shock to the economy, to the capitalist economy. Why? Well, because for the first time in the history of capitalism, the state had to take on an unprecedented role as main employer and main producer. And this was not something that people that bureaucrats in government wanted, but they were compelled to consider war collectivism as an alternative because it was the only way to actually win the war. It was obvious that if you left it to the market, what would happen was that profit, as it is in its nature, was going to lead Britain to lose the ships because merchants were selling the ships to the enemies because it was more profitable. And resources were being diverted to luxury goods. So clearly what became obvious in just a couple of years, in 1914, 1915, is that by 1916, Britain, the cradle of laissez-faire capitalism, had to undertake a massive restructuring of the economy in favor of fundamentally state-run enterprises and political controls of the economy. So this basically intrusion of the state in the unfettered realm of the market provoked a huge repoliticization of the two pillars of capitalism, which are private property of the means of production and wage relations, right? The main pillar, wage relations. These two pillars that until that moment were considered a given, the only way possible to run society, no one was questioning them, were all of a sudden thrown onto the table, and people were seeing that it was about a political decision to safeguard them. So what I show in the book, and I can't get into the details, but you can, it's all about archival work. So I went through the archives, and the effort here is to really give voice to the spirit of the time. So I look at really what was being written on the newspapers, both of the bourgeoisie and of the workers. And what you really see is that it was a moment of existential crisis of capitalism. No one believed that the system was going to last more than a couple of years. And we're not talking about Russia or Eastern Europe. We're talking about the West, the hub of the system. So chapters 2, 3, and 4 of the book basically look at the whole spectrum of possible alternatives to our system, which were not in the abstract. What I show is that they were extremely concrete and real. And there were a variety of options out there that were being taken very seriously, both by the bureaucrats in power and by the various workers groups, from unions to more radical worker councils. So I talk about all of these experiments, the Sankey Committee in Britain, which was all about nationalizing coal and the mines and putting workers' self-governance at the center. So self-management of industry was the biggest call after the First World War. 1919 was the big year of self-management of industry and of agriculture as the main driver of these revolutionary efforts. So the spectrum is wide, from more reformist to more statist to finally more radical solutions coming from the shop steward movement in Britain, which took a very interesting form in Italy with Antonio Gramsci and the council movement that was very big in Turin, the city that I'm from, actually. And what you see is that the council movement that is described in detail in chapter 4 was an effort to rethink, to abolish both the capitalist economy and the capitalist state with a new nucleus of horizontal labor relation, which were demanding economic democracy as the basis for any possible substantive political democracy. So the denunciation of the bourgeois order as being possible to be politically free without economic freedom was clearly out there. So since I got to South Africa, I got really into reading a small passage that Togo already heard like 3 times. But I like it. Togo can like summarize it. This is from the book. This is from the Italian philosopher and academic Zeno Zini gave the inaugural lecture of the newly founded Turin School of Socialist Culture. It was a school for workers. A speech titled From Citizen to Producer in February 1920. He argued that the citizen, as typically understood in bourgeois democracy, is an abstract individual, one who is sovereign in theory, when in fact he's only such on the day of elections. All the rest of his time, he is nothing but a subordinate to laws and rules drafted outside of his contribution. An individual's political servitude is founded upon economic servitude. The inequality of economic conditions, or better, the inequality of the positions within the relations of production, impedes any genuinely democratic relations among free and equal human beings. On the other hand, Zini wrote, the post-capitalist society will give the rise to a new man, the conscious producer, who exercises an economic and political freedom. It will be the new society of free and equal producers. So this was kind of the idea, is that we could actively construct a classless society based on the idea that we were all participating as producers, which would be then, and this was the embryo were the factory councils that through federation, neighborhood councils, city councils could in fact completely overthrow the status quo. So this is what the first part of the book is about. It's about this existential crisis of capitalism. And I do think that this first part of the book can really be interesting for us to get some insight for us today, because actually taking history seriously means that we can learn from past struggles and see the weaknesses and the strengths. And especially for the L'Ordine Nuovo movement of Gramsci, what you see is that a big strength of the thinking there was that he realized clearly how you also needed a different worldview, a different methodological approach to the world in order for having successful political action. So this is, I think, is one of the biggest successes of this Gramscian framework, was to say we need to bring back workers' agency, and the sense that you cannot have advancing theories without knowledge that comes from the very participation of the workers in the councils themselves. That's why L'Ordine Nuovo was a magazine, but it was written in the first hand by workers who were exchanging ideas with intellectuals, with the idea that you could only have really knowledge that could move forward if we were participating firsthand in the struggle and not just being reduced yourself as an armchair intellectual. Now, the second part of the book is where the counteroffensive kicks in. What I show is that in all of this momentum for a different world, the elite got scared and organized fast and intelligently. And how did this happen? Well, the book looks at 2 important international financial conferences in Britain and Genoa, 1919, 1922, in which for the first time, economists were brought to the floor to advise governments on the correct economic policy. And here it's really interesting because what now we are very used to, the typical rhetoric of we are all on the same boat, we should all sacrifice because we've all lived way above our means, and we should really understand that there's our necessities out there that we cannot breach. Were really framed very eloquently in those years. So this is from the resolution 5 of the Commission on Currency and Exchange, just to give you a sense of how much it resonates with us. The complementary steps arresting the increase of inflation by increasing the wealth on which the currency is based may be summed up in the words increased production and decreased consumption. The most intensive production possible is required in order to make good the waste of war and arrest inflation, and thus to reduce the cost of living. Yet we are witnessing in many countries production below the normal, together with those frequent strikes which aggravate instead of helping to cure the present shortage and dearness of commodities. Yet, in our opinion, the production of wealth is in many countries suffering from a cause which is more directly in the power of government to remove. The control in various forms, which was often imposed by them as a war measure, has not yet been completely relaxed. In some cases, business has been even taken by governments out of the hands of private traders, whose enterprise and experience are a far more potent instrument for the recuperation of the country. Another urgent need is the freest possible international exchange of commodities. So this is really what we are quite used to. But in those years, they were putting it even more bluntly. In the words of Brand, he was saying, the solution is work hard, save hard, live hard. This is the type of rhetoric. And the idea was that people are ignorant. They don't understand what's going on. We, the experts, know it all and will set the tone for the years to come. So then what I show is that how this austerity code was implemented broadly throughout Europe. I focus, and throughout the world, by the way, but I focus on 2 countries, Britain and Italy. And the reason for focusing on these 2 countries is to really show how what happened under fascist Italy and what happened under liberal Britain in the 1920s was much more similar than people would expect. So this idea that they're polar opposite worlds, there's liberal capitalism, so democratic, and then there's fascist authoritarianism as 2 completely separate ideologies and institutions. Well, this breaks down if you look at what actually happened in the 1920s. And what you see is not only that the treatment that British citizens, British workers got in Britain and Italian workers got under Mussolini was basically the same. Okay, so what you see is that the whole austerity trinity was violently foreclosing alternatives and disempowering workers. How? Well, of course, fiscal austerity in the forms of cutting all social benefits and basically killing the welfare state that had just been born during the war years was crucial because, of course, if you don't have health insurance, if you don't have education and you need to pay for it, you will be more prone to go and work for a wage, right? So the taking away of resources is intelligent politically and economically, because once more, you secure the fact that the people will have no other option but to accept exploitation. And what I show is also through data is that once fiscal austerity kicked in, also in the form of extremely regressive taxation, and monetary austerity induced an incredible amount of unemployment, strikes ended, unions got weaker, and the profit rates went up while the wage share went down. So you really see the success of austerity in compelling the people to accept capitalism as the only way forward. So this was true both in Britain and in Italy. The policies were really similar. Of course, while in Britain they were relying more on the impersonal market forces that were coercing people through fundamentally unemployment that put workers in competition with one another. In Italy, we also had the strong hand of the state through Mussolini, who was jailing, killing, and beating all political opposition. However, what you see is that the Brits and the liberal establishment internationally, both in the United States and in Britain, were really applauding Mussolini. So what you see is that in the 20s, without austerity, fascism would have never become the strong dictatorship that it was. And this is also because, and fundamentally because, of the support of liberals at large, both domestic liberals like Luigi Einaudi, who then recycled himself as a big anti-fascist, and Luigi Einaudi was our first president of the Republic after the fall of Mussolini. He had only praises for the efficiency of Mussolini's policies. Mussolini undertook the greatest privatization campaign in the 1920s, laid off 63,000 public employees, increased taxes on the people while eliminating inheritance tax and all capital levies, and of course eliminated strikes. Strikes were illegal, unions were illegal, and while the observers were all really happy, and this is Montagu Norman of the Bank of England, even Montagu Norman, the governor of the Bank of England, who expressed wariness of the fact that under fascism, anything in the way of otherness was eliminated and opposition in any form was gone, added in the same breath, this state of affairs is suitable at present and may provide for the moment the administration best adapted for Italy. He continued, fascism has surely brought order out of chaos over the last few years. Something of the kind was no doubt needed if the pendulum was not to swing too far in quite the other direction. The Duce was the right man at a critical moment. And then I got all from the archives of the Bank of England and the archives of the Foreign Office at Kew Garden, the Treasury Archives. And what you see is that it's full of these types of, this is Graham, the ambassador, a British ambassador in Rome. 18 months ago, any instructed observer of national life was bound to come to the conclusion that Italy was a country on the downgrade. It is now generally admitted, even by those who dislike fascismo and deplore its methods, that the whole situation has changed. A striking progress towards the stabilization of state finances. Strikes decreased by 90% and working days lost decreased by over 97%. And an increase in national savings of 4,000 million lira over the preceding years. Indeed, they exceeded for the first time the pre-war level by nearly 2,000 million lira. So again, this is what it takes to stabilize the economy. So one of the thought-provoking insights of this case study that I think is very useful to also assess and analyze austerity throughout the 20th and 21st centuries in many other countries of the world is that austerity is fundamentally an anti-democratic, repressive project wielded by the ruling class purposefully to subdue workers. And this can be done differently. In Britain, what was crucial was independent central banks. Again, this is the last thing I say before I close, is that now we take for granted that monetary management is in the hands of the central banks, that we have no say on what they do because, of course, they're not democratically liable. Now, this was actively constructed in the 1920s, in a moment in which there were calls for nationalizing the Bank of England. Ralph Hawtrey, the protagonist of my story for the British case, was overtly saying we need a central bank that should never explain, never regret, never apologize. And this is the idea. Inflation aversion, virtuous monetary policy can only come from an institution that is completely detached from the people. And they exported independent central banks all over the globe. My protagonist, Brackett, went to India and brought the central bank in India, independent. The other guy, Otto Niemeyer, the other controller of finance, went to Brazil, all over. So independent central banks are not so far away from what Mussolini did, which is instead take all these economists of the neoclassical framework, and this is something we'll get to the Q&A, I didn't have time to talk about it here, is the important role of neoclassical economists. This was a paradigm that was emerging. What we study at school today, when we take economics, is not neutral science. It was meant to look neutral, and this was the big insight of those times. They were emerging as experts, as those who were above class politics. And what you see is that these experts advising Mussolini and advising the British Treasury were wielding extremely classist models, but that were hiding their classist bias. So to conclude, the models that were popular during the revolutionary moment in 1919 were the models of classical political economy of Smith, Ricardo, and Marx that said it's the worker who is the source of value. And it's enough to think about here what happens with the mind. It's the worker who goes and digs and is exploited and gets the value out, right? And the models of these political economists were all about class conflict, zero-sum game, what the workers get, the capitalists don't get, and vice versa. And this was how they were understanding capitalism. Now, the new models of the neoclassical framework that emerged in these years I talk about were models in which classes were dropped in favor of individuals, and individuals were seen in harmony with one another. So no conflict anymore. And guess what? Instead of the worker, you would have the entrepreneur. So the idea is that the value is not coming out of labor. The labor theory of value has dropped. No one teaches the labor theory of value anymore right now. Why? Because it's politically dangerous. The labor theory of value tells you that it's the worker who is essential for capitalism. Right now, if you study econ, going back to the original models, they put the entrepreneur first, saying it's actually the virtuosity of being able to abstain that gives you the savings that then you're then capable of investing. And guess what? Workers are just basically should be just grateful because they're getting wages that come out of your capacity to save, right? So this is really what I would like to conclude with, is that austerity is both coercion and consensus. And while coercion is the austerity trinity, this needs also backing of sophisticated economic theory, this theory that we have all kind of internalized that is really crucial to giving us a sense that what is being done is really the only way forward and there's nothing political here. But of course we know, and this is the whole point of the book, is to say, let's really realize how political this whole thing is. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Fascinating presentation. Thank you, Prof. Clara. We are going to take a short break for about 10 minutes. So it's 10:18, maybe let's say 12. So we'll come back at 10:30. For those who are in the room, there's tea at the back. Please feel free to have some tea and stretch a bit. And then after we come back at 10:30, we are going to have a few responses to bring the discussion back to our context. How have we been, working and understanding this concept of austerity? And then we'll have insights, firstly from Tshidi, and then Busi, and then Fundi. I'll introduce them after, but yeah, just to bring the discussion back. And then we, having reflected on that and the context, we then open up a Q&A based on what Prof has presented and what our colleagues have responded, how they've responded to the discussion. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A session in particular. I've seen people jotting down, taking notes, so it should be fun. Thanks.
Zimbali, can you hear me?
Welcome back in the room, guys. Can we please settle down? We hope the people online can hear us. We are back. And we're going to kick off. Thanks for keeping time. We are starting off the responses with Tshidi Lencoasa, who's in the room with us. Tshidi is a budget researcher at Section 27, which is just above us. And she advocates for budget interventions that protect constitutional rights in education, healthcare, and in the context of climate change through a gendered lens. She currently serves on the steering committee of the Budget Justice Coalition and the Imali Year 2, which is another coalition in civil society. So I think it's quite special. All three of our guests have served in the steering committee of the BJC in one way or the other, which is awesome. And Tshidi basically also works with the South African, or her work rather focuses on the South African National Treasury to make the budget more accessible. And she's a Mandela Washington Fellow for 2023, a firm believer in the power of the budget as a tool to alleviate inequality in the country. I'll end it there. Without any further delays, please give your responses, Tshidi, 10 minutes.
Thank you. Hope everyone can hear me. And thank you for the opportunity to respond to such an important conversation. You know, and an important phenomena that's happening, which I'm sure everyone in the room will attest to. So, like Zimbali said, my name is Tshidi, and I'm a budget researcher at Section 27, and we are a public interest law center, and we work on advancing the constitutional rights to basic education and healthcare. And so our interest in budget allocations really stem around how do we protect the right to basic education and the right to access healthcare services in a context where, you know, the funding towards that is dwindling. Is there any, well, you know, our view is that, yes, there's a lot of conversation, and correctly so, about the quality of spend in healthcare and education, but we also are of the view that if you cut down on the quantum of spend, so the amounts of funding that's allocated, that also impacts the quality, and so it does threaten the realization of these rights, particularly to those in the most vulnerable contexts in the country. So for learners who attend fee-free schools, of which I think 67% of the school-going population is, and people who use public healthcare services, which is about 84% of the population. So South Africa, definitely, we find ourselves in deeply challenging circumstances where we've had two concurrent states of national disaster that have been declared. There have been stories of endemic corruption within the state, and there's been slowing economic growth over the past decade, which I believe Treasury or government then reverts to reduction in public spending as a way to respond to this slowing economic growth. So our overall sentiment, I think I have explored that healthcare and funding allocations over the past decade have ignored the rising number of uninsured people and the increasing cost of living that has impacted the sector. So while this year's budget was particularly concerning because there was no increase to healthcare, even though the healthcare funding, even though there are more people using the service and the cost of living, inflation is going up. Generally, yeah, so they were concerned that it just means that the value, this is being eroded, like the value of
the investment in healthcare, as well as for basic education. So some areas do receive above inflation increases, but others don't. And we're concerned that this may threaten the protection of the right to education for most vulnerable learners. And we're also interested in the quality of spend. But what we're most concerned about, and I think this is what Clara spoke to, that while the funding for healthcare and education has dwindled over the past decade, the debt servicing costs or interest expenses for the state have increased exponentially. It's the fastest growing area of the budget, and unlike until last year, so this year they've rectified. So basic education is the area of the budget we spent the most on in the country, but last year it was interest expenditure. So we spend more servicing our debts as a country than we do on healthcare, and just slightly less than we do on basic education. So as an organization, we recommend that, well, obviously we reject the austerity because of the impact. We cannot see how the right to basic education and healthcare for the most vulnerable people in this country will be protected when there's less funding to achieve that. If there's less money to pay nurses, there's less money to pay teachers, you know, that results in overcrowding, that results in like straining the healthcare system. And we say that if there are cuts that are going to be made to these areas, that they must be based on a transparent and participatory human rights impact assessment to demonstrate that these reductions will not increase inequality in the country, and it will not undermine people's rights to access quality basic education and healthcare services. And we also call on for gender responsive budgeting workshop this year that is public so that it can be shaped by the intended beneficiaries. I know that Busi and Fundi maybe will talk more in detail about gender responsive budgeting, but we also know that there is a gendered implication to the realization, or to austerity and the realization of basic education and healthcare rights in the country. There's a disproportionate burden that is carried, that's aggravated by the feminization of poverty phenomena that we've seen over the past decade, where there's been a gender gap that exists at every poverty line in the country, particularly in rural areas, which I think Fundi may speak to, so I don't want to take away from those points. But when areas like early childhood development, education, school nutrition, HIV and AIDS funding are cut, it means that women tend to disproportionately bear the burden of these cuts because of the gendered and racial norms in this country that have pushed all kinds of responsibilities, including care work, onto Black women. And we also argue that funding allocations towards basic education and healthcare that are not gender responsive may overlook how different women and other marginalized communities in this country experience social spending. So an example that we found is that the budget for medicine and goods and services, contraceptives in the country account for 40% of the medicine stockouts, but there's been no increase to the funding or no response to that by the budget. So that's a gender oversight. And that means that it affects women and girls directly and their ability to access sexual and reproductive healthcare services, which is a constitutionally protected right. We've also seen that this is especially important in a climate change context because women's health has been found to be at higher risk due to our vulnerability to climate change, especially in low and middle income countries. So women were more affected. Studies have shown that women were more affected than men by nutritional deficiencies like malnutrition and anemia caused by food insecurity, and that pregnant women were more likely to experience miscarriages and stillbirths with rising temperatures and food insecurity. Women in particularly those in rural areas where renewable energy was not available, were at increased risk of developing respiratory conditions because of the use or inhalation of toxic pollutants when they use hazardous traditional biomass to cook food. And women are also more likely to be at risk of vector-borne diseases because they're more likely to be near rivers when they collect water, and increasing temperatures exacerbate those risks. So all this to say that 2 minutes. Okay. So all this to say that when it comes to Okay, I only have 2 minutes, but I'll say that it's okay. When it comes to education and healthcare funding, we have seen over the past decade that the value of it has eroded. So inflation has increased while the allocations to them, sometimes there have been increases, but they've been below inflation. And so these are like the real value of this investment has been eroded. And so when the government makes the political decision to address interest on the debts that the country has carried, particularly, I mean, now what's more topical is like the debt from Eskom, but also other state-owned entities. What this means when they allocate funding towards that and cut funding towards education and healthcare, it is the South African, the everyday person in the country who suffers from this and who has to carry this burden, but particularly, and this is has gendered implications, has implications for people who live in rural areas and all of that. So if we really want to redress inequality in this country, we can use the budget as a powerful tool to do that. And in order to do that, it would mean having to confront the austerity that and the fiscal consolidation that government is partial to. We reiterate the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights recommendation that South Africa increase the level of funding in social security, health and education for that reason. So yeah, I hope that that makes sense. And I'm on time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tshidi. Definitely on time. Thanks for touching on, I think, what is a key component of the Trinity, which is the fiscal austerity component. And I think the work more generally in civil society has tended to be in line with more or less what Tshidi has been outlining, you know. But of course, Prof Mattei challenges us on some of the conceptualization we've had with that. And I would want us as a room later on to reflect on, you know, how our advocacy has tended to be and whether or not it's, you know, useful in the context of the Holy Trinity, the austerity Trinity. Sorry, stability not holy. Stability not holy. Yeah, for some people. But yeah, I'm hoping Busi is already online to give us a sense of, you know, more broadly her work in terms of the macroeconomic framework and hopefully touch on the other components of this Trinity and how her work has sort of revolved around it. For also laying out the context in a way. Also, this is just a section to bring us back to ourselves, and then we unpack the discussion in the next session. So Busi is an economist and researcher. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Economics from Duke University and a Master's in Political Economy of Development from SOS, University of London. She was previously with us, the IEJ, those who don't know, where her research focus was on macroeconomic policy, including feminist budgeting. And Busi, like I said, was also the co-chair of the Budget Justice Coalition. And she's published a number of works in feminist economics, including social protection, debt, macroeconomics more broadly, and she considers herself as a feminist political economist in training, who is determined to be part of the unwinding structural injustice. So Busi, if you can hear me, please take it away, and then we'll conclude with Fundi.
Yes, thank you. I hope you can hear me. I just need a thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay. Thank you for inviting me here. I just want to start my input by saying that I am here in my personal capacity. So the views that I'll be expressing are not those of my employer, but my own. And to thank Professor Mattei for this brilliant book. I think it really highlights the importance of economic history, which is of course not taught as it should be in many contexts and for students. And I think it goes to the broader discussion about the econocracy and how these ideas are reproduced, which you touch on in your book, really, about how economics is reproducing itself as a sphere of study in the way that it has. And I just, I think one thing that I wanted to know, Judy, is about, the contradictions in capitalism itself, right? So we know that capitalism, and you speak about the social relations of extraction, and this idea that if everyone works, they're part of this class society in a way, but, it is contradictory because, as Marx pointed out, there'll always be a reserve army of labor that is unemployed. And so in the South African context, unemployment is so high that many people are not part of the system to begin with. And so you've got a class society where majority of people are non-waged workers, by themselves. And so the compulsion to be part of the labor market is, in a way, in the capitalistic way, is undermined by also this broad scale of unemployment. So you're compelled, but you're also unable to access these opportunities. And so, and thinking about from a gendered perspective, Mary Mays, I hope I say her name right, I always say it like this, but anyway, she speaks of women's bodies and labor as the last colony of accumulation. And so this brings back to this question of, who absorbs the shocks of this austerity, of this capitalistic mandate? It is really the households, right? Because capitalist production requires more activities than what we see in the market economy itself. And so, in South African context, think about the households, they're seen as expandable, as, having free and unlimited resources to buffer the shocks of austerity, which Tshidi's already spoken about, right? So if you cut healthcare, guess what? People have to be taken care of in the household, right? And the household as a sphere of really subsidizing capitalism, where the worker is produced, so to speak, where we reproduce ourselves as labor in the economy, is continuously undermined and continuously, seen as this important sphere, but invisibilized in many ways, right? So it's hyper visible, but also invisibilized in many ways. And so it takes me to this issue of just really the distributional impacts of macroeconomic policy. And, when we talk about the trinity of fiscal policy, of monetary policy, of industrial policy, and I like to say, racialized capitalism and patriarchy. And so, Lynn Osome, whom some of you might know, says being a feminist political economist is about taking seriously, and I heard Professor Mattei say this, taking seriously history. I'm not sure, okay. So Professor Mattei mentioned that, it's about taking history seriously, and, Lynn would probably expand it and say, history, economic and social processes seriously, right? So in the South African context, of course, we're talking about capitalism, but we're talking about a particular type of capitalism, which is deeply racialized, which is deeply gendered, which is reproducing itself in a particular way. And I think, Professor Mattei was saying, how can we apply this to South Africa and not say, look, all the things you've written about in your book, we can really imagine them in South African context in the last 30 years, unfortunately for us, right? And you speak about the language of neutrality, which is true in the South African context, right? We're hearing the language of trade-offs, we're hearing the language of the deserving poor, who gets to get grants and who doesn't. We don't want to give them to everyone because then people won't work. So there's clear, parallels between what you've written here and what we see directly in our context. Okay, do you have a couple of more minutes left? Look at me for the first time on one time. But to say that what also struck me in this book—
Yeah, 6 minutes.
I'm so good today to the question of democracy and economics. I think, in the South African context, it's such an important concept, right? Because in South Africa, we talk a lot about democracy and how it is so important in our society. But really, in economics, clearly there is no democracy. And so the president is able to come and say, African women are the face of poverty. But then when we talk about, you know, the economic policy making and the politics of it and how we engage in economics, you know, these African women that he speaks about are sort of far away removed from this discussion about how the economy impacts them, how their labor is extracted and exploited, how, you know, Black women, Tshidi spoke about Black women, how Black women in our economy are extracted from in two ways, which is underpaid work and unpaid care work, right? So you've got these dual impacts that are happening to these women in many ways that sustain the capitalistic society that we see. And wait, I don't know. I'm jumping around here, but I apologize for that. And there was another thing that, yes, and speaking of wages, I mean, you know, of course, wages in South Africa are a very topical issue. We know that the capitalistic accumulation, how capitalism was designed globally, but also in South Africa, was on this premise of cheap labor. And in South Africa, of course, the cheap labor was of Black bodies, Black people, in a very particular way, and how that has gone, or over time, if we look at this issue, we see how it's perpetuated in the current context. I had a conversation with someone yesterday, and they were saying, of course, the tax brackets are shrinking because everyone is leaving the country. And I said, do you really think like that many people are leaving? And it's not that, it's that many people really fall below the taxable income threshold. So in a way, capitalism, again, the contradiction here, you want low labors, you want low wages, but at the same time, you want to extract tax from these same people that you don't give enough wages to even be able to extract from. And Professor Mattei spoke about low wages and consumption. We want consumption, but we also don't want to pay people enough to be able to consume and sustain themselves. And so the capitalistic project itself is failing on its own terms, precisely because of these contradictions that we see in the system. I'm actually going to be shorter than, because there were so many things that I wanted to respond to, but at the same time, I don't want to, what's the word? Jump around too much, because I think I've spoken on a number of issues. But to really say that as capitalism or capital is reconfiguring itself during this crisis, you know, we're obviously going to see more and more strain at the household level. And this is where I think feminist political economy analysis is critical. And I think what, you know, in reflecting on these conversations and the work I've done on austerity, you know, I call myself Busi Anti-Austerity Sibeko, and being anti-austerity fundamentally means being anti-capitalist. And I think it is very important that in our spaces of activism, that we are clear about that we're not shying away from this idea that it is actually about the bigger structure itself. And I think sometimes we get boggled down into these small conversations. You know, now we're talking about debt and it's like here, and we're talking about spend and it's here, without really tackling the broader systemic issue explicitly. I'm not saying we're not doing it, but it really saying that we are against this system, which in itself can be changed, and which, you know, I'm forgetting her name now, but, you know, we are living with capitalism, but it doesn't mean we have to always live with it. And I think sometimes, you know, there's this tendency to move towards capitalism reform, as opposed to saying away with capitalism entirely, you know, as a whole thing. Thank you. That's all from me.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. So Fundi, if you're online, please be ready to come in as well. So just by way of introduction, quickly, Fundi is also an economist and a development and social justice activist. She works at multiple levels of society, collaborating to challenge and change systems that perpetuate inequality and poverty, and therefore promoting equal access, participation, and a voice. Her work is about rural democracy, transformation, and she's currently studying public law with the University of the Western Cape through the Dula Omar Institute. I'll end there. Fundi, if you can also just say something so that we can just see if the room can hear you. Is she there, Julie?
Yes, hello, morning.
Hi,
Morning, colleagues.
yes. Morning, we can hear you. Thank you so much. You can begin, thanks.
Awesome, thank you so much. I'm actually using two devices because my laptop speaker has failed me this morning. So I'm actually speaking via my cell phone. So hence I'll be going down every now and again. I just want to be clearly audible for all of you to hear me. Nonetheless, thank you so much. Good morning to everyone, and thank you for having me. And I really want to appreciate Prof Clara Mattei's book. It's really been triggering in many aspects, you know, as a former economics student, and really how the future looks like, you know, for first-year students, and how you know, have people like yourselves and many other scholars been able to deconstruct the theory that is actually now being taught in schools? Because, you know, during our era, Marxism was just about what it takes to deliver the worker to the factory. But when you read these kind of books, it really gives a lot of nuance that really we are deconstructing some of the literature to be informed by people's lived experience. And this is what my work has largely been about over the past few years. It's really been about connecting the theory of economics, but to the practical work of it and people's real lives, where it's not just about the numbers, the percentages of GDP, but it's also about, you know, it's also about people's real lives. I think for me, I'm going to open my session around freedom and democracy, and particularly because yesterday was Human Rights Day in South Africa. So I had a lot of reflection of my own that I was actually doing yesterday, and how far we are in the pursuit of achieving freedom and lived justice as a society. Freedom and democracy allow us to express discontent and to call for the South Africa that we want. Governments are implementing austerity measures at a time when the world and South Africa is facing a major cost of living crisis and trying to recover from COVID-19 pandemic. In 2023, it is estimated that this year alone, 85% of the world's population will live in the grip of austerity measures. There will be unavoidable impacts for most, particularly women, girls, and non-binary people. In the rural South Africa, we have witnessed and experienced how austerity policies blend patriarchy and neoliberal ideology to further exploit the most oppressed people within society and deliberately dismiss their needs. I have been privileged to work and be a part of the rural democracy advocacy space. And these are some of the strategies that we have implemented against the background of austerity. Hunger. We have established food security gardens at a household level and on communal land. This means that out of the social grants received from government, households still have to save and put money aside to buy their own seedlings and implements. This is against the background of agrarian reform that sets barriers and boundaries for this kind of farmers on the right to food, but also to choose the food they want to produce. And that prohibits communities from creating their own seed banks and to have access to water. Again, this is a neoliberal tactic that causes heavy reliance on the state by the affected communities. Despite these limitations, my work is about building alternatives such as regenerative agriculture to the aforementioned struggles, which saw us introducing alternative, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. My work has contributed to building the capacity of rural communities on food security through introducing agroecology and permaculture as an alternative solution, because this method is proven to use water less to respond to climate change, but also it is an inexpensive method. These backyard gardens are now profitable businesses. Part of the solutions that we have implemented to respond to austerity or find ways and means of livelihoods is the pursuit of building a people's economy. I continue to advocate and mobilize in the informal economy through Street Vendors and Hawkers Association. Their work is very precarious in nature and often sees them disadvantaged in benefiting from social relief packages and any measures that have been introduced by government in the past. During COVID, they were deliberately left out of the value chain because of their economic status. This meant that we had to educate street vendors and hawkers on the municipal bylaws, which determines where they operate, how they are structured, and where they are possibly positioned politically as well by the respective municipalities in South Africa. This also meant that we had to educate street vendors and hawkers on budget literacy, because their budget allocation is situated within the district municipality and not at a local level, and how they can access this grant. But our work was also on the protection of their human rights and dignity. My advocacy and campaigns work, particularly on 16 days of activism, has been largely influenced by austerity. The SOMI leading campaigns in rural and peri-urban municipalities, raising political consciousness on austerity being economic violence, which then results into gender-based violence. One that is deep-rooted in macroeconomic policies, such as austerity. Also, in the past few months, we've also campaigned and petitioned quite a few local municipalities on the socio-economic development initiatives that are not picking up any weight on the ground, particularly when it comes to basic delivery of services such as water, access roads, sports fields, schools. Some of these projects have long been implemented, but they are nowhere near their completion phase, no completion status being given to these projects. This then saw social justice actors like myself mobilizing and building civic agency around the affected communities to exercise their rights, to have an informed voter participation, but also to have these affected communities leading some of these struggles. So you'll see social justice actors like myself being in the middle, but sometimes leading from the back. To date, we have received communication from the Auditor General that one of the infamous stadiums, which we were pursuing and advocating for, will be audited in this year's in this year's audit. So those are some of the gains for us in the work that we've been doing against austerity, because in that campaign, we strategically called for an end to austerity, gender responsive budgets, open and transparent budgets, and many other call to asks that have been tabled by the affected communities. And in the last few months, since having received communication from the Auditor General as a Chapter 9 institution that is tasked to monitor such projects, but you'll find that there is a gap of social audits that does accompany audits in South Africa in general. This has also caused myself, to be on the political radar of some of these politicians and the business people that are linked to these projects, because I've since seen a lot of searches by politicians on my social media accounts, but also the business people involved. So this is just some of the bravery and the double-sided approach when you do this kind of work. In closure, feminist economists have warned for years that the global and economic system is violent towards women and girls. Women in the workplace are too often poorly paid and exploited. They are denied basic rights, such as pension or maternity leave. Hundreds and millions of women in informal work that traps them in poverty. This stark gender injustice in the economy combines patriarchal norms and laws to keep women oppressed and their needs neglected. Thank you. I'll pause there for today.
Thank you so much, Fundi, for speaking on those alternative strategies that really at the ground level you've worked with and have worked with communities in trying to come up with alternatives to this what seems inescapable austerity. And I think part one of the book also delves in historical terms how workers were also useful, and I'm sorry if I'm misinterpreting it, in undertaking the struggle for an anti-capitalist alternative. I'll now thank you to all our speakers, Tshidi and Busi. I'll now bring the discussion to the room. We've heard from the prof, we've heard from our respondents, and I'll open up a Q&A session for the next. We have a lot of time. We have about 50 minutes to just discuss, ask questions that have either emerged in the first session or in this session on any of our respondents. They're still available online to also respond. And yeah, let's have an open and constructive discussion. Please raise your hand and then I'll note the first round and then we take it, and then I'll note like 3 rounds of hands to begin with. I see one hand from the gentleman at the back, Gilad, and just 2 hands for now. Oh, and Dali, 3 hands for now. I think we can be heard if we speak up, right? Or do we need? Okay, we'll move the mic. I'll just.
Thank you very much for the quite an interesting I'll try to be a shop steward, which I never was, but I will claim it. Yeah, so I think thanks for quite an insightful lecture. Couple of things. The first one, you mentioned quite an important point about on the history of the UK and Italy and how capitalism, and I suppose in this sense, austerity was very similar, even though obviously Italy was fascist and the UK, as you mentioned, liberal system. I do recall that, in fact, obviously starting from the Gramsci era, even the later eras, so you have Bologna, Polonzas, I mean, a number of these Marxists who write from either Spain, Greece, Portugal, and all of those. All of them almost very pessimistic and hugely disappointed because the working class in those countries, post the First World War, even post Second World War, chose fathers, paternalistic fathers to lead them rather than choosing the revolution, you know. But more interesting in the way that we are putting it. So if maybe then we use more kind of Bolunsa's approach, so of capitalism as a system, and Bolunsa's, yeah. So effectively of looking at capitalism as a system, and in this case, I suppose my interest is around. So maybe, in your view, how do you explain these two distinct social formations playing out, and yet both of them, in essence, caroling the system of capitalism, but using two specific political formations, you know. So on one hand, you have the UK that is using a liberal system, you have the fascists on the other hand, and I think that might be, and maybe in how then essentially over a while, political formations, and maybe what does this tell us about the issue of political formations in the capitalist system as a whole? Obviously, in South Africa, it depends on who you are. So we are able now to vote. I happen to be born in a time when you couldn't, and live through that time, at least a bit of my life. But now I can. But still, the capitalism still continues, and so maybe some discussion around in looking at that economic history, how what does that tell us about political formations within the capitalist system? And then and maybe my last question, I think, I think the important point that you are making is that the problem is not just austerity, the problem is capitalism. And maybe then my question is, I think because a lot of us are anti-capitalist, or maybe let's say we claim to be, and we are in political formations in different ways that are, what are actual concrete struggles that you see possible, you know, out of that?
Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much. And thanks very much for that input, Clara. Mine's addressed to the room and Clara, in the spirit of open conversation. And three sort of points, two more towards Clara. The first is that, let me preface this by saying that the presentation of a class analysis and situating the politics of austerity, I think is very welcome and very important to the work which the different individuals and organizations do. My first sort of niggling thought is that there's no doubt that there's a well-established link between what you've described as these three spheres, right? Structural adjustment programs in Africa and Latin America in the 80s, 90s, you know, combined all of these elements: fiscal austerity, privatization, labor market deregulation, and so on. And so these as a composite set of agenda is, you know, is an established understanding. To me, it's not clear what is gained, and there very well might be. My copy of that book is at my in-laws because it arrived after Christmas. But exactly what is gained by considering those other elements, austerity, whereas austerity is generally considered around fiscal and to some extent monetary policy, is not clear to me. That's not to undermine that those are not part of a systematic agenda, which I think is pretty well established in sort of left analysis. The second is that I struggle a bit about the sort of implications for South Africa. And in particular, around the idea of, there's no doubt in my mind that austerity is a political project, but I am not convinced that austerity, at least in its fiscal and monetary sense, is necessary or being driven by the maintenance of a capitalist political order in South Africa, right? We have levels of unemployment which do not require austerity to reproduce the wage relationship, right? You could have an expansionary social system in South Africa without threatening the capitalist order in the same, which is very different. And I think a convincing argument which you make about the US now and all of those, but the context of the deprivation in our society means that we don't need cuts to healthcare or the social services or anything like that to maintain this architecture. The architecture is so entrenched, right? And so that leads me to question, what is it which drives austerity more narrowly conceived, particularly on its fiscal and monetary sense, right? And the role therein of a path dependency around economic thinking, around a ideology which not very innovative bureaucrats are imbuing, right? But that's still maybe not a satisfactory answer. But I just don't think fiscal austerity is necessary to maintain the political order in South Africa in the same way as the examples given, which why then? The last point is just for all of us to think about, which is, what is the relationship between a narrower anti-austerity agenda, which also mobilizes around rights, which is quite different, I think, to sort of left mobilization elsewhere, and a more radical agenda, right? And how do we not, and how do we see them as complementary, right? How do we see the assertion of the need for funding of vital services as complementary to a reconstruction of the economy in a broader way, and not as a cop-out, right? Well, not either sort of narrowing it and just remaining in what I think you rightly criticize as like a technocratic like space, but also not remaining in that space, but also not dismissing those distributional, more sort of narrow struggles as part of a broader, reform which can have a revolutionary kind of elements. And getting that right for ourselves, I think, is a strategic question which we need to think about.
Yeah, you can go. Okay. Is it related, just because there's so much that I feel that maybe there's a lot? Otherwise, I feel like I don't do a good job at remembering what's going on. Brilliant questions, super important, all of them. And I also had a couple of points I wanted to answer to Busi and Fundi, who were wonderful, and your presentation as well. So you guys brought up a lot of stuff. Okay, so about political formation. So I think ultimately, what's interesting is that capitalism is an extremely adaptive, for how contradictory, it's also very adaptive as a system. And so ultimately, depending on the context and on the threats to it, the political formations vary. And when I say threats to it, I'm not like attributing agency to capitalism alone. I'm attributing agency to the collective decisions that are being made by the ancients that play certain roles within our society. Okay, so in this sense, when workers have lost, basically, then that's when you see fascist, more in how one understands like fascist Germany, which is, by the way, Nazi, but one tends to use the term a little bit more broadly. But the point is that these extreme right-wing movements, I think, are really the expression of the success of austerity, because it has worked so well to disempower people and to individualize people, that then ultimately, especially what austerity has worked so well in doing, is concealing, hiding how things work instead of explaining how things work, right? And this is where the role of economists and mainstream economists are really important, right? If you hide what is happening, if you hide that the system is based on exploitation and that the state is actually preserving exploitation, and we can discuss in the various modalities it can do it depending on the context. And again, this is a very contextual book. I am looking at a specific historical moment and a specific place in the world. But yet I do think, we'll get back to it, I do think that trying to do the opposite of hiding it, exposing the logic of austerity, can really help counteract, right? So I think this is the thing, like, so fascism is usually understood as already kind of the outcome of the success of austerity, and it convinces individuals that the fault is of those who are even lower. I was yesterday at the Apartheid Museum, and it's very interesting also how here ultimately, how the nationalist cause gained exactly from the impoverished agriculture workers and impoverished workers who are coming into town and feeling threatened by the system, and ultimately taking it on the lower ranks, right? So that's the expression. I think. And the other point about political formation, not only that capitalism is adapted, is also that the strategies to protect the system cut across party lines. And so that is very important, is the point of like being a little provocative of saying, let's look at, if you use the lens of austerity, what happens in liberal democracies. Look at what's happening now in France. I mean, Macron is not giving a shit about what the people want, right? So he's just like completely, and the media is just saying, oh, there's violence in the street. Well, there's violence in the street because there's the most huge violence going on at the level of the political institutions, who are so detached and oppressive. So, you know, what's happening is that very much different from what Mussolini was doing. I mean, you know, again, capitalism evolves. We are in different historical moments, but there's such similarities that I think are very important to be kept in mind, right? So cutting across party lines means that the Workers' Parties also internalized a lot of the logic of austerity, because they internalized the idea that there is no Tina, right? There's no alternative. And I think the ANC in this country did a lot of that too, right? Ultimately, in just saying, okay, we need to attract investors' confidence. And this is the only way we can actually grow. And this is exactly the logic of, we want to depend on the market and also on the international market, which is even more of a chokehold for citizens in the south of the globe, right? Just some thoughts. It's a huge question, so that's great how you framed it. Okay, what is gained? And then I'll go back to this. What is gained? This is a very important question. Thank you for asking it, because I think it's really where, it's where like the test, like, you know, it's like the test, does this book actually give a contribution that is relevant for political struggles? What is gained? I think, I personally think a lot of it is gained because it gives you, I really think there is a lack of conceptual clarity by not having kind of one lens, one framework that can really immediately point out to the connections of the various spheres that govern our lives, right? The connection between cuts in the budget, interest rate hikes, privatizations. I feel like it's wishy-washy when one discuss like what you read around. I always felt like, okay, then it's ultimately always attributable to neoliberalism. And then you talk about privatization, then you limit it to budget cuts in general. I don't know. I've always felt like it could be actually very powerful to have one concept. And of course, my claim is that we should enlarge the concept of austerity, right? The idea is that we shouldn't understand austerity as we normally do. We should use it and talk about austerity capitalism. And I think pointing the finger to austerity capitalism really helps, because it points the finger to the fact that the system only works if it constantly extracts resources from the many to the few, if it's constantly shifting these resources, and it has to keep doing this. So you say, right, the second point of the question is you don't really need it in South Africa because ultimately people are already disempowered. Now, I would not agree with this necessarily, in the sense that I think this is it might be a static lens, in the sense that the system is not created once and then remains. It's the construction of our society is a constant operation, a constant activity, a constant ruling of the elite in order to protect the system and make sure it doesn't break. So sure, right now here the unemployment rate is so absurd that the reserve army could be smaller and you would still get people going to work, right? You could say that, and I agree with this line, but at the same time, people might open their eyes in one moment or another, and you want to prevent that from happening, right? I think the point is that you want to prevent alternatives from cropping up. And we just heard here, especially from Busi and Fundi, how there is activity on the ground. The point is that it's not noticed because it's actively hidden and constantly defunded and under-resourced in order to avoid these alternative projects to gain traction, right? So I think this is the point. I mean, the fact of like budget cuts on social expenditures, because this is what we're talking about, right, is really a way to constantly blackmail people. Because it's constantly the case that, sure, a lot of women can work harder in the household to, how you put it really nicely, to absorb the shocks. But at the same time, you need more money in your pockets if you want to do anything in your life, even if you want to meet, right? For me, the emblem of austerity was the fact that these activists in the townships didn't have money to like move and meet. They couldn't like physically meet because of the lack of the rights to transportation that had been completely curtailed. So this I would think that one shouldn't like just focus on the reserve army and the like unemployment rate. That is one point, but the other point is market dependence is more than that. I believe market dependence is just the idea that we need, simply put, we need money in our pocket to do anything in our life, to breathe, basically, right? To drink now, almost, to move, to get cured. Anything we do we need money in the pockets, and this is the strongest chain. But this chain, you need to keep feeding this chain. This is the idea right here. You can't stop feeding the chain, right? Because if all of a sudden you do start giving resources to the people, I can assure you that the people think large, because the people know much better than those in power what exploitation means, and that exploitation exists, and that you can't have capitalism without exploitation. This is something that economists, when you go to school, you learn about. Exploitation is not a concept you learn, right? So the elites can pretend exploitation doesn't exist, but the reality is that people on the ground know exploitation exists. So this, I think, is the big thing, is that if you start giving resources to the people, technically it could be possible to increase social expenditures right now, because indeed you could find ways to do it. But again, economic issues are deeply political issues. So this is the thing, like, there is the threat that if you give to people a bit more, if they do have the resource to meet, if they do have the resource to get together and think, right, instead of like always constantly having to think about how to put food on the table, I don't think the system would survive very long, especially given the contradictions that Busi pointed out so well, right? It's so contradictory. Like, it's really impossible to kind of justify the system any longer. So this is what I think. It's like really, especially in this moment of advanced financialized capitalism that is showing all its like blatant contradictions, I think this project is a constant need to extract resources to make sure that people don't think about alternatives. I don't know if that convinced you, but I do think that, again, it's about how the economic and the political are deeply inseparable, and how and I think the problem of the left is that this is a really thing, I think a huge problem, is that the left is more defeatist than the people in power on the right. Like literally Janet Yellen, who by the way is considered more of a progressive than anywhere else. So like take Larry Summers, these big names of economists, they are terrified by the political consequences of inflation. They are terrified about people uprising, unionizing. They understand that we need to keep the majority weak in order for the system to survive. Instead, I do think that the left somehow has bought into the idea, you know, we're weak, we kind of, the end of history perspective somehow has like really, I think, been internalized by the left. And this is a problem because then I think it kills our capacity to struggle. And to the alternative point, and then I close. You guys both brought about like, so alternative. I agree. I think here, all projects are extremely relevant. And I think there are like, how I was framing it the other day, which is not particularly original, is that I think there needs to be a double strategy in operation. One strategy is, of course, the pressure on the government, right? And so all these studies on the budgets and on how they should be related to human rights and how clearly people are suffering has to be constantly present as a form of struggle. But at the same time, I think the other form of struggle is going on the ground and doing alternative forms of livelihood, which Busi was telling us about, Fundi was telling us about, activity from below that is actually economically empowering and empowering also from a point of view of capacity to think about alternatives. And it's only when you start doing things that spaces to imagine further paths forward become possible, right? It's only when it's praxis. Praxis is really the key. So I really do think that it is about like finding alternative livelihood that can break away from market dependence. And I think that's really the key of the power of the people. If you can find ways to break from market dependence, then you start releasing the chokehold. So I really do think that these are two elements that need to constantly go together because they can empower each other. And that's why I think institutions like yours is very important that you keep in touch with the struggles that happen on the ground, that maybe have less resources, but the networks that can get created between the centers that then speak with policymakers and the actual realities that are real, alive, but ultimately a lot of times are not seen because they don't even have the means to be seen, right? And that I think is our role in these mediation roles as academics or as participants, as researchers, is to connect the two strategies and to keep them alive together. And there's so much human potential, like just what I saw in Cape Town and I'm seeing here. There's a lot of human potential. It's difficult to organize, of course. That's the difficulty, but it's difficult. What I want to say is that it's also difficult for the ruling classes to maintain the rule. It's not an easy job. That's why austerity is so important, because it's not an easy or obvious job. It's a constant struggle on both ends, but we need to use all the means we have, I believe.
So shall we take? Okay.
Are you hearing us online? Where's the microphone?
Oh, okay. Sorry. Hi, everyone. Can you hear us online? No.
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay, so Kelly, okay, wait, Neil, do you want to go then? I can.
It's
Okay,
no,
yeah,
it's
we can
fine.
hear you.
If you were gonna speak, go for it. I can raise my issues when you want me to.
Yeah, he's just popped out. So
Okay, Neil, go. I think you can go ahead.
Thanks, Clara, and the discussants. I think following Busi's point and Gilad's points, for me, I agree completely that you need a political rather than a technocratic understanding of austerity. But for me, what I'm grappling with is the notion of coherence versus contradiction. I think we're in an increasingly unstable and crisis-ridden system. And I think there has to be acknowledgement of the fact that a lot of the things that the ruling class, the state, etc., does have a strong element of incoherence and crisis management, irrationality, which actually results in unintended consequences. So, what Gilad and Busi were saying about the economic and social contradictions in South Africa is, we have an adoption of a crisis of an ideologically driven macroeconomic policy stance in South Africa, which seems to bear no relationship to even the imperatives for capital in South Africa, and more reflect a more ideologically driven approach, which has all sorts of negative consequences for the ruling class. So, Clara, you referred to Gramsci, and I think it's quite relevant that, in Gramsci's notion of hegemony, there's a strong element of co-option of the working class and working class forces. So for me, fascism and those types of social orders don't represent the success of capital, but represent the failure of capital to impose that hegemony. And in the context of the crisis, like we're seeing globally now, to have to reimpose social order and to reimpose the conditions for accumulation represents a weakness, not a strength of capital. So the question is, what are the limits to those types of strategies? Because in terms of Marxist thinking, what you're talking about is almost like a constant process of primitive accumulation, where through forcing people off the land, taxation, etc., you're forcing people to work, and you are generating this constant process of resistance as opposed to a process of co-option and incorporation. So, I mean, certainly in South Africa, it leads to massive instability and crisis. So it would be good to get your reflections on this issue, the polarity between a social democracy which incorporates working class forces and a more, repressive order which generates class struggle, or is also a response to class struggle, I guess. And finally, to what extent you see this as being the function of the crisis of accumulation, both globally, so that comes back to the question of the necessity of austerity in reestablishing the conditions for profitability globally, and I guess in our country, in the context of multiple crises. Thanks. So there's quite a lot of noise, but I hope you've been able to hear me.
Okay, sorry, and then Sarashni, do you want to go ahead with your question? If we could just keep it brief as we are running out of time, and then Kelly, and then Busi would like to respond.
Thank you. Thank you so much for giving me a chance to ask a question. I just have a question to do with something very basic. On the ground, we have a situation in terms of the discourse among ordinary people who feel very defeated because they believe the corruption narratives as being the biggest. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? You can. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yes.
You can. Okay. So because they believe that that corruption is our only problem and the source of all our woes. And if you try and present them with a very ambitious communist agenda, they tend to recoil at the idea. They like the outcomes of what communism might give them. They might even agree, but they just believe it can't work here, because what the capitalists and their media have successfully done is destroy the imagination of people that more is possible using a corruption narrative. We also, I think it's also very ironic that we're having this discussion on a day or 2 days after a progressive march that happened around the country, and our president behaved like a dictator, sending out the police and military in full force to basically suppress protests, valid protest against his regime. And basically, lots of ordinary people also basically support his actions, and there isn't enough pushback that is actually a bad thing. That you can't have in a democratic state democracy being undermined by the state while we have rabid austerity, neoliberalism, and an attempt to privatize state resources. So I don't know how we go beyond this corruption narrative. Never mind that we don't have enough of an emphasis that within socialist thought is the idea that privatization itself is a route for corruption. It in itself causes corruption by privatizing and having deals and contracts where the state does nothing except use consultants and contractors to do the work that government should be doing. This now is the next level that's being imposed on us. And I am really a bit cheesed off that most good people did not come out in support. The thing is, we all want to say this politician and that politician have nefarious intentions because they've been implicated in this and that one's been implicated in that. Lots of things untested in courts of law. But really speaking, our options in South Africa are very few. And I actually supported that march because we need people who want to end austerity, who are looking at socialism to win the politics here. Because little sessions where we understand the problem, but it doesn't filter to the population, is not going to solve our problems. There has to be a political connection to all these wonderful struggles that don't even have a public view. It's outside of what even the public sees, and it's good work you're doing, but it's not connected to the politics on some level.
Should I take one more from Kelly? She's had her hand up for a while. Zimbali.
Hi. Should I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead, Kelly.
Okay, thanks so much. I'll try to keep these two questions brief. I want to thank you so much, Clara, and also to the discussants for such fascinating input. I had two issues that I'd like to invite your reflection on. One, I think, is connected to this question of how can we understand austerity in South Africa with our specific, huge unemployment and specific kind of relations of disempowerment and oppression, and how does austerity operate in this context when there is already this enormous reserve army of labor. One kind of, I think a lot of this discussion has been focused on a state or national level, and I wondered whether I'm sure in the book there's also a global analysis of how power operates in kind of global regimes of accumulation, perhaps through international financial institutions, how austerity is reproduced or perhaps kind of imposed from within North-South relations, and whether you see that there is any element of I guess imperialism, neocolonialism in the in the production of austerity kind of in the global south. So that's one, you know, in order to drive accumulation in kind of geographical centers of wealth and power. So that's one question I had for you. And the other is in South Africa and you know, I'm conscious a lot of other places, one of the kind of frontiers in the fight against austerity is the need to expand social security in the form of cash transfers, social grants, and possibly, you know, basic income or universal basic income. And I'm curious how you view this, particularly with regards to the issue that you raised of cementing market dependence. So, you know, criticism of basic income and universal basic income that we get from the left often is that cash, you know, serves to kind of possibly cement market dependence, and it doesn't actually provide sustainable alternatives in terms of allowing people to create, you know, sustainable livelihoods outside of this you know, these capitalist class relations. So I'd be curious in your thoughts on those two questions.
Okay,
the mic, sorry.
Maybe going backwards. No, maybe not. Let's keep it. Let's keep it in order because I think it makes more sense actually in terms of. Okay, so yes, definitely the incoherence and the fact that when this capitalist state reverts to coercion, it's already kind of a failure of the best functioning of our system, which should actually be functioning on impersonal compulsion, not personal compulsion, right? When it becomes personal compulsion in the form of like a state actively suppressing people politically, then of course we are in a situation in which the incoherence and the contradictions are even more explosive. And this is, I think, why it's also a moment in which right now there is more interest in opening our eyes, in the sense that I really do think the talks I gave around from the book, the type of audience, my students, these forms of overt anti-democratic and authoritarian pressures are I think antagonizing more people than usual. So I think there is a good critical sense that is opening up for sure. One of the most that's the thing, right? Because ultimately, I think right now we are in a moment in which, while historically there were some historical moments in specific historical contexts in which it was compatible to subordinate the working class with maintaining economic growth and kind of kind of an idea of some form of shared prosperity. I really don't think right now we are anymore in this circumstance. And so even more than ever, I think today it is clear that economic growth is not at all the purpose of austerity. It's like so overt. There's all these studies that show that when austerity is imposed through structural adjustment programs, budgets are not faring better because economic growth is repressed. And I think here it becomes visible how we should leave the technocratic perspective as if what people in policy institutions do is actually care of the good of the economic machine as a whole. Well, clearly what is happening is that what is happening is that people are just trying to protect their privilege. So we really need to, I think, especially in this historical moment, move away from the fact that those in government really even care about fostering economic growth at all. Maybe it was possible in certain moments to care about economic growth while still preserving the political order and the capital order. Right now, it's clear that we are in a moment in which it is compatible to do the two, and what is prioritized is the capital order. And I think right now, the fact that there are 52 countries around the globe that are risking serious debt issues and defaults, right? There are actually 8 that are about to default. Sri Lanka is one of them. Ghana is one of them. Then I forgot the other, but I forgot the other names, but it's easy to look. The IMF is saying so what is happening in with the IMF in Sri Lanka, they just passed they gave just a tiny amount of money just the other day. They finally reached an agreement. It's obvious, and everyone knows that the type of adjustments that are being proposed are adjustments that do the opposite of increasing the possibility of the country to grow. And it's actually just increasing market dependence. This is what the reforms are all about, right? So going to the last question that was being asked also about North-South relations and what's happening is clearly that the IMF projects are all about increasing the market dependence of Sri Lanka to international creditors, right? You need to take in debt in order to do anything. This was I was listening to the economic update of the Financial Times, and it's a great, I can assure you that reading the Financial Times and listening to the experts of the Financial Times they bring to talk about issues is mind-opening. They're just saying, this country needs our money, so this is what they got to do. And it doesn't matter if what they're doing is like doing the opposite of what like supposed economic rationality tells you to, which is like do growth-oriented policies. But the whole point is that it's so clear. Now, how long will this last? Because ultimately, if all these countries go bankrupt, this is where I think ultimately the incoherence comes out, because the people on the top can do whatever it takes to try to preserve their power. But ultimately, I think we are in a historical moment and this will break apart. But this will not break apart on its own. We really do need to mobilize on the ground at all levels and connect, as you were pointing out, what we do at the level of academia and policymaking with everything else. And this is really important, I think. The corruption narrative, absolutely. That's another enormous success of austerity. Individualizing the issues. Again, you conceal the systemic issues and you focus on individual issues that are completely disconnected with the real life workings of our system, right? Because the focus on corruption is not only individualistic, it also gives you a sense that we've completely lost a lucid analysis of what the role of the state in a capitalist society is all about. So people that can go and blame corruption is clearly because in our schools, we don't learn the basic of how the state under capitalism works. Because what you would know is that corruption is not an individual issue. We should talk about systemic corruption. And this is where the work, I keep citing her because I think she's one of the best scholars out there. This is where the work of Camila Vergara comes in. She wrote this book called Systemic Corruption. And the subtitle is something about anti-oligarchy republic. But the point is that if you look at systemic corruption, then you realize that systemic corruption is another feature of our capitalist socioeconomic system, which includes the political formations that the first question brought up, right? And so systemic corruption is the fact that there is a structural detachment in the bourgeois constitutions between the represented and the representatives. The representatives, once they are elected, they are completely separate from those who they supposedly represent. Just by the fact that they make money that is 10, 20, 30, 40 times more, even more than what. So they completely lose connection with the real problems of the people, right? But this is in the constitution of liberal democracies, and this is systemic corruption. So that's the problem. Like, we really need to, I think, re-own the word corruption and say corruption means nothing if you don't embed it within the system and realize that it's systemic and it's a feature of the capitalist state. It's not something that is exceptional, oh, it's bad. That's the moralistic bourgeois framework that is so disempowering that unfortunately the media is all about. But we need to know what's happening at the level of the media. Yeah, and about universal basic income. Listen, I think here there's many issues at stake. I really do think that any political mobilization is good political mobilization because it increases political awareness of the people. So if you can mobilize people for the universal basic income, that's fine because it's one way to get people thinking about their economic conditions collectively, right? Now, I don't think that is the solution, and that's why I think all around us here, and this is why I write the book, is that the solution is not reform, but revolution. But again, revolution is reached through phases. It's not an event, it's a process. And part of any struggle, if you think big, is one step in that direction of gaining traction, of getting people, opening people's imagination, right? You said it killed political imagination. That is exactly what austerity does. And this is exactly the story of the book I tell, how you kill political imagination. And that's why even struggles like the universal basic income, with all of their limits, I think are useful if they're seen in a perspective of thinking bigger. And that's why, though, we need to think bigger and we need to keep the other side of the strategy alive, because universal basic income ultimately makes you depend on the state, right? So it's still dependence, more on the political institution than on the market, but it's still a form of dependence. And this is what we don't want. We have to avoid being dependent on external forces that ultimately are led by people that are oppressing us, right? So that's why I think it's more utopian to try to reform the capitalist state and the capitalist system than to try to actually bring about activities that are overcoming wage relations and the bourgeois state altogether. And this is not abstract, it's very concrete in what people are doing always, I think.
Thank you very much. That was just very expansive. I do think, and this is just a side point, was not the side point I was going to make, that broadening the understanding of austerity as you have is quite critical, because if we reduce it to just the technocratic understanding of fiscal consolidation and monetary consolidation, what we end up doing is not seeing its intended aim, and budget cuts viewed from a political understanding, you first defund, then you privatize. So the two are almost one in the same, and that has been the thing that has happened in Eskom, in Transnet, in the health services across the world. You defund, then you privatize. So it's like seeing it like within this whole holistic frame is quite critical. I think what I was going to say, though, because it got me thinking about, I wear various hats, and one of those is in the climate space, right? Where climate finance is like a critical thing. And the way in which the moves around that have been about mobilizing public finance in order to move us from billions to trillions through almost incentivizing private finance by mobilizing public finance. But this gets me to think that I guess the incoherence is like, we are doing this, yet austerity is like the key function of the capitalist order, right? So are we, even within the problematic private financing pathway, right? Given that in order to get to those trillions, we need to mobilize public money to get to those trillions through the private, like, will we, when the capitalist order functions within this whole austerity kind of like matrix, will we actually be able to even respond and even get the quantums of private financing that they are saying? And in fact, the Inflation Reduction Act by America, that is about reducing inflation, but yet stimulating green industry. I mean, it's just very incoherent within this understanding of like a monetary consolidation. Like, how do you do that? Like, because if you are de-risking, you need that public finance to de-risk. But anyways, that's minor point.
Okay. So my question is more so in the more concrete growth and GDP area. So in the context of capitalist economic development, which is what the present government is claiming to try to do, what is the logic of austerity, of reductions in education and health, considering that now when you want to industrialize, you sort of need people that are highly skilled. So compare, for example, industrialization. Let's say in the 1950s, you could take someone from the farm and then put them in a factory. Now you need someone that has went through basic education, tertiary education, healthy and whatever. So how does the government sort of balance its role between trying to suppress labor by not giving resources, but still play its role in supplementing capital by providing it with skilled workers? So yeah, in that area.
Hi, Busi, you can go ahead and respond.
I hope everyone can hear me. I just said, I mean, now I feel like I'm moving us back, but I just wanted to input quickly before I leave. And thank you all for these grades. I think the commentary has been very interesting. I think one of the things we have to think about collectively, and I think, Professor Mattei, gives us the historical framework to think about when do certain things matter more than others, right? So in the South African context, even with the arguments for austerity, it's like a continuously shifting goalpost, right? In one year, it's about Eskom debt. In the next year, it's about, achieving a surplus. The next year, it's about how we've been spending through an incrementalist process, and therefore that's bad. And so, this idea that capitalism, or not even just capitalism, but government's reasons for why they're pursuing austerity are continuously shifting, right? And I think it's important that as civil society, as economists, as researchers and whatnot, really take on this idea that where do we hang the towel on, so to speak. And I think Professor Mattei really provides us with the great thing, right? Austerity capitalism. We're not going to sway with government's reasons for austerity from year to year. We're going to pin ourselves to this one reason why it continuously perpetuates itself and give counter arguments for why that in itself across time is important, right? And I wanted to talk also about this idea about state and violence. I think, there's certainly room and space why state of violence is such an important factor of the political economy, right? So when we think about South Africa and the violence, the high levels of violence that we experience in our society, I think it's also important that we bring in this lens of austerity capitalism and how violence helps to maintain, this austerity capitalism that we see. And I think the last point I wanted to make was around this idea of, I think, Kelly was asking this about the international, there's a paper I've written about debt, a feminist approach to debt. And in this paper, I basically argue that, the whole debt question or the whole debt arguments have led to policy externalization really in the global South, right? And Professor Mattei has spoken about this, about how, they need this money, so to speak, right? If we think about it like that. And so policy externalization is happening continuously. And in South Africa, we have almost a different approach, because it's not really policy externalization the way that we think about it. It's more like internalized austerity capitalism, right? It is an active decision that we've made, not because we've been forced to, but because ultimately governments are willing to really implement austerity even if they're not asked to, right? Because they believe that for the global markets, to appease the global markets, this is what is acceptable. The fear, and in fact, I reflect on this a lot, and I think we're in a place of fear. It's actually, I think our government in a way operates from a place of, if we do something differently, we're so afraid of what this potential outcome could be. Like, it's a paralysis point of view. So if, you know, we don't want to think about Greece, ignore Greece, because that's the worst case scenario, but also we're not willing to do something good. So we'd rather maintain the status quo. And I think that's where we are. And I think as civil society, it's also important that when we're engaging at the micro level, which Fundi has already highlighted, I think I've just been doing some research on gender and tax. And I think what is clear to me is that sometimes we assume that upper class people, educated people, also understand these problems. And actually what I found is that people had a very poor understanding of their relationship to tax. Even if they are working people who are falling in the 1%, they don't understand that, for example, VAT impacts them every single day, you know? So I think we have to broaden our horizons about who is our target market, who are we speaking to, and at what level are we engaging with people, to be able to take this, whatever we're discussing here, because this is a very high level discussion, to be able to take it out of the space. I think we have to think critically about who we're engaging and how we are engaging them, and not in the ways that we've always done. So that's all I wanted to add on my side. Thank you.
I think you point out to a really important issues. I mean, I was studying now this Sri Lankan case for an article I wrote lately, and I think that's really like a school case, if you want, really an emblematic case of how incoherent it all is, because clearly the IMF knows that the type of policies that it's asking the government to do, so the usual privatize, increase taxes on the poor, increase interest rates, all of this will only really increase the debt of the country, right? So it's obvious that they know it's producing, it will produce, and the IMF is forecasting a slowdown of the economy and recession in all of these countries. So it's really interesting to note how they kind of overtly are, but now it's like an overt knowledge that debt will worsen with these policies putting into place. But this is exactly, I think, the logic of the game, right? And it's exactly the fact that, I mean, for industrialized countries, it is never about, for developing countries, it was never about industrializing them, developing them. It was always about fostering underdevelopment so as to extract resources. So please, let's get out of the mentality. This is really a plead that at least us in this room get out of the mentality that there's any economic policy under capitalism that is done with the lookout of the whole, because the contradictions are inherent. Even the capitalist classes are divided and there's all these conflicts. And of course, the point is that the real necessity here is to subordinate entire populations, entire zones of the world in order to constantly be able to extract resources, increase the profit rates in specific areas of the globe. So it's very important to keep this class analysis at all levels, local and global, but please, let's leave the idea that anyone is really working to boost the economy as a whole. They are boosting market dependence, and I think this is really important. And to answer these last points about the incoherence about the green economy and how is it possible that you increase interest rates, but at the same time you want to boost the green sector, and about the de-skilling and how do you then provide for skilled workers. These are all, I think, issues that emerged if we really focus on how capitalism works. We're not the planned economy. It's an anarchic economy, right? The anarchy of the market. This is how it should be studied. There are a bunch of individual agents competing ferociously for resources and for opportunities for profits. And this is how capitalism moves. And that's why ultimately countries in the South are really with their hands tied, because as you were saying, the point is that you need to increase investors' confidence. So what's the paradox here is that the investor confidence, you increase, because the investors are those who, the individual agents who come in and invest, you increase the investors' confidence if you show that you're taking care of the austerity agenda of the IMF. Yet this paradox is this austerity agenda is clearly increasing the debt level, which will make you even more dependent on investors' confidence. And this again is like, it's like a trap that like actually feeds itself. And how long will it last until everyone is poor? And you say the Greece is the worst case. Unfortunately, it's not the worst case. If we look at like, people are starving in Sri Lanka, as many other places in the world. It's not in the interest of capitalism to like worry about starving people. That's not in the logic of capitalism. The logic of capitalism is to move where profits are being made. So to go back to your points, these are really where the contradictions emerge, because if you had a planned economy, then there would be, and I'm not advocating necessarily putting a planned economy, but I'm trying to say that with a planned economy, these problems would be like kind of tried to be resolved at certain levels, right? But we are not in a society that works in a planned way, right? So these are real issues that can explode. I agree.
Excellent. Thanks very much. So these last 2 points by both Clara and Busi on the anarchic nature of the system and of the international dimensions, for me, reinforce a concern which I raised and which has been reinforced by part of this conversation, is I do not believe that it's true that there is cuts to social security to undermine political organizing. Nor do I think it's true that these cuts drive people in education, for instance, into private provisioning. These cuts to social grants make people starve, okay? And those cuts to education make people leave the education system entirely. There is not a market to cater there, and there is not a reliance on the sort of like pitiful social security for things like social organization. And I think that's a story too heavily based on intentional actions of domestic elites, right? Which I think this point of the anarchic nature and the international is really important. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a medium-term game, which Pisani illustrates, which is that there is no doubt a marketization of provisioning, right? And there's no doubt a prioritization of places of accumulation. So the energy system, there's no doubt that the privatization there is an attempt to create a new point of accumulation, right? And there's no doubt that in the medium term, the underfunding of education may create points of accumulation for like a private education system. But there isn't this more short-term element of stabilizing a system through these cuts. In fact, the system of capital accumulation in South Africa now is much more unstable than it was in the 2000s, in which those services were being expanded, right? There is much more instability. There is much more threat of popular resistance to the current order now than during a period in which they were being successfully co-opted through the provision of public services, right? And those public services played a very important role in those periods of actually creating the stabilization of the system of accumulation at the time. So I'm not pushing back against the broad sort of point of the financialization and marketization of social life, okay? And I'm not pushing back against the fact that underfunding and so on, and privatization is a part of that. What I'm saying is the contextual analysis for me in the short term has to be really sort of locally contextual. And I think it is different here in its more short-term features. Again, I think we as people who want to be challenging that really need to get to the heart of that, right? Of the contextual. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So that's what we need to ask ourselves, right? And I think that it's got more to do with the last 2 points raised. The first is South Africa's position in a global economy and the power of international rating, international finance capital, which is all part of the same order, right? I'm in no way saying that there's not a systemic order here, right? I'm just saying how it plays out in each context, and I'm pushing back about on a deliberate domestic elite attempting to throw people off education so that they access private education or healthcare, when in fact what they just mean is that they die. Okay, right. So, but that's not to push back against a dominant logic which exists. But so I think that needs to be explored in its international dimensions in South Africa, and it needs to be explored in its contradictions about sort of an anarchic sort of policy making, which is incoherent more at times and not necessarily deliberate at times. And I think it needs to be explored in its ideological, theoretical sort of context around the dominance of neoclassical economics. And I don't know what the answers are. Right? I like honestly don't. But I don't think it's like domestic elites throwing people off social welfare so that they have to access immediately so for me that there's still kind of grappling to be done around how to understand the immediate manifestations and why policymakers in South Africa are so committed to that, despite the fact that I strongly believe it's destabilizing for capital accumulation at present, and that expansionary policy was more stabilizing for capital accumulation in South Africa.
Shaking my head. Yeah, should I answer? No, please. No, so, no, all I wanted to say is that I think part of what I found quite convincing about the book is that it provides a framework for understanding, or at least beginning to make sense of why it is that these what seem to be irrational policies are implemented globally. And we have the same thing here in South Africa, the same austerity style being implemented from the 90s. We don't have enough history to go back to the 1920s to find out, has this been a constant thread throughout our economic system? Some would argue that it has. Some would argue not, because of the nature of apartheid capitalism or racial capitalism. So we have a bit of a nuance. So the question that I think the book raises for your questions or your skepticism is that I don't think it's illogical. I think there is a rationale to what is happening. And that rationale is about understanding who the winners are in this current game. So there is an argument that there will be destabilization and certain aspects of capital will take a hit, mainly domestic capital will take a hit here. But we have prioritized international capital by just bailing out Eskom as an example, as one example of flows out. And if you look at what's on the shelves, just in terms of what's coming into the system and what industries are being destroyed, we're gutting our own economic ability to not go into a debt crisis. And I suspect we will go into a debt crisis. And that is the rationale, that this is actually reordering the global capital extraction on South Africa. Yeah. Oh, I thought you were.
No, I'm saying those are precisely the factors we need to look at, and not the notion of a coherent domestic elite trying to push people off the services.
Sorry. The point is that maybe I did not explain accurately what is actually in the book, because the idea is not to say they privatize so that they access private services. That's not at all the story here, right? The story is looking at a specific moment in which capitalism was really being questioned at its core, right? People coming up with all these other ways of living, and then seeing how, temporarily speaking, austerity emerges very clearly as a counteroffensive that with a very political logic to it, to disempower these people. So market dependence means many things. It primarily means that you are silenced to accepting the status quo. Then whether you actually enter private, that's irrelevant. And of course, the point here is that history and our current historical processes are extremely complex. And so, of course, there's different factors that are involved. And I'm not trying to say, oh, there's only this lens that matters. But this, I think, is a lens that can really help us realize how, while in certain moment, the timeliness of when austerity is implemented to defeat workers' struggles fundamentally is obvious. And this is obvious right now in the United States. It's obvious, by the way, now in Sri Lanka, which is a country in the south of the globe, because actually Sri Lanka was coming out with people kicked out the president, right? There were 2 million people mobilizing. They occupied, they started thinking about other ways to run the economy. This is when the like fake president came in. They didn't even have elections, and the global elite basically impose further austerity. So again, it was very timely in showing how it is used in moments of social uprisings, in ways that are particularly violent. And again, that's why I think it's the power of history that speaks here, because if you ever have the time to take a look at the actual historical reconstruction, I think you will see that it was overtly said by the actors involved at the time. Now, I'm a Marxist, so I deeply believe in the power of ideology. Ideology meaning that these people that were working, and that's the thing, I did not talk about the protagonists of my book, but the protagonists of my books are economists, including Keynes, by the way, who was a big austerity supporter in the early 1920s when it matters to be austere. Then he became nice with the workers once they had already lost all their bargaining power. But the point here is that these people, they are convinced that this is the right way forward. So again, how complex is this? Clearly, there's winners and losers, and the country falls further in debt, and winners win more and more. But of course, then there's all the spokesmen of capitalism, right? The what Gramsci called oh my goodness, I'm losing the term. Anyway, there's the organic intellectual of the bourgeoisie who are deeply convinced that this is the power of economics, and this is actually one of the themes I did not touch on today, but is very important for the book, is the power of economics in its neoclassical form. And these people who are the spokesmen clearly believe in this, right? So this is another element. So it's not reducible to, oh, there's these bad guys who just want to screw over their own citizens, and it's intentional. Intention doesn't make sense historically, right? It's a weird, intentions is a complex that historians can't really grapple with, because it's about seeing structurally what happens. So while last thing I want to say is that while in certain moments, the timeliness is relevant to actually expose the logic, right? Because it actually happens immediately to revert for uprisings. Most of the time, and this is when people ask me, well, what about austerity in 2008, right? In Europe, workers were not really loud in that moment. I really do think, though, that there's more than the time argument, the temporal argument. What is important is also the structural argument here, which is ultimately also moments in which workers are disempowered. Austerity constantly serves the same purpose of disempowering further and further. So I think this is also important. Like in 2008, of course, first of all, it's never the case. That's the very big point. It's never the case that struggles are permanently defeated. No, going back to the other point. So struggles are there. Also in 2008, you can say, okay, there was not such vocal anti-capitalist activism, but look, there had been the G8. I mean, Genoa was only in 2001. The No Global movement was strong. I mean, there was stuff going on, right? It's not like there weren't stuff. There were a lot of stuff going on, but the point is that austerity is there to constantly protect from the possibilities of this. So I think this is very structural. So, this doesn't mean that there's also all the other elements involved about the global elements and that everything we said. So I don't think it's stupid to think that there's one explanation what is happening. That makes no sense. But I do think that what I contribute in the struggle is that I think the framework I provide here can be useful for people on the ground to be more critical and more like ready to understand what the ruling elite is actually doing. So it's one element that I thought was missing out of the conversation so far, and clearly it needs to be adapted. But I do think that it is powerful because it does empower those who read it and saying, okay, if this is ultimately a constant active effort to perpetuate capitalism, then we can constantly actively organize to break away from it, and this is possible. It's in the realm of possibilities. Let's not be oh my God, let's not be blinded by the successes of austerity. This is the call here. So I completely agree, but I do think give it a chance, take a look. It's probably, I probably was not good at making the case for it here, but I do think it's elements that can help other elements that are already out there, and it can guide our conversation. Can we just open up 2 minutes while we have lunch to the possibilities of how we can get involved here now for moving forward in this historical moment? Maybe you have some thoughts on this. What time is it?
It's time to wrap up.
Like how we can, because I think what I found that was very important for me in Cape Town was like actually connecting people getting to like know the struggles on the ground and seeing how everyone can contribute. So I think that's something that maybe we can even do through lunchtime.
Yeah, I think
what people are actually doing now. That gentleman in the back with blonde hair has a really cool project about like gaining independence from all the technological mediums, which is fantastic.
Yeah, I think let's do that over as we get some lunch. I'm just worried people might, slowly trickle out. But the space is here. Let's use it and let's engage. But thank you so much for a robust engagement. Since the morning, people have been engaged and putting in their views, and that's great, despite the technical difficulties earlier on. Thank you to the Forge. Thank you to Skis, and thank you to everyone for bringing yourselves. Thank you to the respondents, and most importantly, Prof, for coming and doing this book tour for us. Thank you so much. That ends the session.